Imagine standing outside in underwear during the Siberian winter. The air is minus 40 degrees Celsius. Within minutes, your skin crystallizes, your heart rhythm stutters, and your blood turns to slush. Yet, 40,000 years ago, humans didn't just survive this nightmare. They thrived in it. They didn't have heaters, they didn't have synthetic fabrics. They had something far more dangerous and effective: pure biological ingenuity. The story begins in the Upper Paleolithic period. Glacial maximums were turning Europe and Asia into desolate ice sheets. The temperature was a constant, biting minus 40. At this temperature, steel becomes brittle like glass. Exposed flesh freezes in less than 60 seconds. But our ancestors were not retreating. They were expanding. Survival wasn't about willpower. It was about engineering. First, let's talk about the clothes. You might imagine a primitive man wrapped in a loose, patchy fur rug. You would be wrong. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sungir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, tells a different story. We found burials adorned with thousands of ivory beads. These beads were not just jewelry, they were sewn onto skin-tight tailored garments. These early humans were master tailors. They used bone needles, some as thin as modern steel, to stitch hides together with incredible precision. They understood the physics of heat retention. They created double-layered clothing systems. They used soft, thick furs like wolf or Arctic fox on the inside, facing the skin to trap air. They used tougher, weather-resistant hides like reindeer on the outside to block the wind. This layering technique is identical to the systems used by modern mountaineers on Everest today. But clothes were only half the battle. You can wear the thickest parka in the world, but if you don't generate internal heat, you will eventually succumb to hypothermia. This is where human metabolism became a superpower. In the extreme cold, the body demands massive caloric intake. Our ancestors were not eating salads. They were eating bone marrow, fermented organ meats, and high-fat blubber. A single kilogram of fat provides 9,000 calories. By hunting megafauna like the woolly mammoth, these hunters secured a massive, calorie-dense fuel source. They didn't just eat for energy. They ate to keep their internal furnaces roaring. Their basal metabolic rate was likely significantly higher than ours today. They weren't just surviving the cold, they were burning through it. Then, there is the social technology of fire. Many people think Paleolithic fire was just a campfire. It wasn't. It was a sophisticated chemical process. In the deep freeze of the tundra, wood was scarce. They burned mammoth bones. Dried mammoth dung and bone marrow contain enough lipid and fat content to burn hot, steady, and long. They understood combustion at a chemical level, using these materials to create hearths that acted as the centerpiece of their social architecture. This brings us to the most important factor of all: psychological endurance. When you are sitting in a dark, frozen landscape for 18 hours of darkness, your mind is your greatest enemy. If you panic, your heart rate spikes, your blood vessels constrict, you lose heat. The ancient survival strategy was communal bonding. Living in tight, semi-subterranean dwellings, partially dug into the permafrost to insulate against the wind, these groups lived in constant proximity. They shared warmth, they shared heat, and they maintained a constant cycle of storytelling and tool-making. The ritual of flaking flint was a meditative, calorie-efficient way to stay alert. They were never alone, and in a world of minus 40, isolation was a death sentence. We have to acknowledge the physiological adaptations too. The Denisovans, a sister species to modern humans, carried a specific gene variant called EPAS1. This gene, likely passed on to some modern populations through interbreeding, helped regulate hemoglobin production in low oxygen, high altitude, and high cold environments. Our ancestors weren't just culturally smart, they were biologically optimized. They were the apex predators of the ice. So how did they do it without modern gear? They treated their bodies like precision machines. They calculated every calorie. They engineered their clothing like second skins. They mastered fire chemistry. And most importantly, they recognized that the individual was doomed, but the group was a furnace that could not be extinguished. We look back at them and see primitive survivors, but if you dropped a modern executive into the Siberian tundra of 30,000 years ago, they wouldn't last a single night. We have traded our metabolic flexibility for comfort. We have traded our ability to endure for the ability to automate. The humans who conquered the ice weren't just enduring nature, they were constantly negotiating with it. They realized that cold is not an enemy to be defeated, but a physical condition to be managed through constant, deliberate action. Today we spend our lives in climate-controlled bubbles, terrified of a draft. We have forgotten what the human body is actually capable of when the stakes are absolute. The next time you feel a chill, remember that your bloodline is defined by 40,000 years of people who stared into the absolute zero of the Ice Age and decided they weren't ready to freeze. We are the descendants of the most successful cold weather survivors in history. The question is, if the warmth we rely on vanished tomorrow, would we still have the wisdom to build a fire, or have we forgotten how to live? There's a detail most documentaries skip entirely: children. An adult can rationalize pain, ration movement, delay gratification. A child cannot. And yet infant mortality data from cold-adapted Paleolithic populations, while brutal by modern standards, does not show the catastrophic collapse you'd expect from a species unprepared for Arctic exposure. Infants at Sungir and similar sites were buried with the same craftsmanship, the same beadwork, the same care as adults. That tells us something important. Entire social systems were built around protecting the most vulnerable members from thermal death, not just the strongest hunters. Swaddling techniques using the softest inner furs, positioning infants closest to the hearth, rotating caregivers through the night. This wasn't improvisation. It was inherited protocol, passed down because the alternative was extinction. Now consider the hands. Everyone focuses on the torso and the core, but frostbite doesn't usually kill you first, it just takes your fingers, and in a world without antibiotics, a frostbitten hand that turns gangrenous is a death sentence delivered slowly. Paleolithic toolkits show something remarkable. Mitten-like coverings stitched separately from the main garment, designed to be removed quickly for fine motor tasks like flint knapping or fire starting, then immediately reattached. The fingers were treated as the most expendable and yet most protected part of the body, because losing dexterity in an ice age meant losing the ability to hunt, sew, or start a fire ever again. Sleep itself was a battlefield. Modern humans assume unconsciousness is simply unconsciousness, but in sub-zero conditions, sleep architecture changes. Core body temperature naturally drops during REM cycles, which is exactly the window where hypothermia risk spikes. Communal sleeping arrangements weren't just about social warmth. They were about staggering those vulnerable windows across multiple bodies so the group's collective temperature never dipped into a danger zone all at once. Someone was always, statistically, closer to waking. This wasn't planned in any conscious sense. It emerged from decades of trial, error, and death, hardened into cultural memory. Then there's the diet detail people underestimate: vitamin D and fat-soluble nutrients. Without sunlight for months at a time, populations living this far north should have collapsed under nutrient deficiency. Instead, they exploited an unlikely source: animal liver, particularly from marine mammals and megafauna, packed with retinol and vitamin D in concentrations high enough to compensate for total sun deprivation. This is why coastal and river-adjacent ice age populations thrived while landlocked groups often struggled more. Geography wasn't just about shelter from wind, it was about access to a specific nutritional lifeline hidden inside organ meat. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. None of this was written down. There were no manuals, no diagrams, no units of measurement for calories or thermal conductivity. This entire survival system, clothing engineering, caloric triage, fire chemistry, sleep staggering, nutrient sourcing, was transmitted purely through observation, apprenticeship, and the brutal feedback of watching people who got it wrong not wake up the next morning. Every stitch pattern, every hearth design, every decision about who slept where was the end product of thousands of silent, undocumented deaths that shaped the survivors into something almost engineered by necessity itself. Modern survival experts dropped into equivalent conditions, even with training, often underperform ancient populations in one critical area: patience. We are wired for urgency, for fixing problems fast. Ice Age survival demanded the opposite: slow, deliberate, energy-conserving action, because panic burned calories you couldn't replace until the next kill. The people who survived were not the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who could sit still in the dark for 18 hours without wasting a single unnecessary movement. So when we ask how they did it, the honest answer isn't one invention or one gene. It's that an entire species quietly became a distributed survival machine, a network of tailored skins, communal furnaces, staggered sleep cycles, and inherited caution refined generation after generation by a filter with no mercy and no exceptions. They didn't defeat the cold, they became fluent in it. And that fluency is still, technically, written into your biology. You just haven't been asked to speak the language in a very long time.